President Tharman Shanmugaratnam. I guess that was the most expected outcome. Maybe what was unexpected was the margin of victory, but I don't think anybody is really that surprised that he is our president-elect. So welcome to episode 67, I believe. 67 of Teh Tarik with Walid. So I will just briefly talk about the election and share my thoughts on some issues that I think played out during the elections and what we can understand from it. Apologies, I didn't do any episode yesterday, and also I must say I have newfound respect for people who are able to react. People like Eugene and Gillian, you know, they are able to react to election results on the fly without showing emotions and so on. I think that's quite an art. Alright, so I really have 6 issues or topics to talk about pertaining to the elections. So the first one is President Tharman itself, or President-elect Tharman, and what it means, the ultimate mandate for him. Second is the referendum on the PAP. The third would be what this means for the PAP in the GE. Fourth, I'll be talking about the spot vote and what that implies for the legitimacy of the election, because the number of spot votes was very low. The fifth one, I'll be talking briefly about race, because that has been a topic of conversation. And finally, I will be talking about the opposition. What does it mean for them? For most of the opposition parties or leaders, even though they endorsed Tan Kin Lian in a personal capacity, people don't really see them as personal politicians, right? People will see them as being part of the party. So only the WP stayed away from this amongst the major parties. So I'll be talking about that. So let's go one by one. So the first one, the ultimate Tharman mandate, 70% is huge. I know that there are some people who say, oh, what if George Goh had ran? What if, and I like George Goh, I've interviewed him before, if Lee Hsien Yang had ran? I think the margin of victory shows that whoever was the one running, President-elect Tharman would have beaten them quite convincingly and resoundingly. How do you argue with 70%? This is not a fluke victory. This is not a small margin. It is clear that Singaporeans have endorsed him. Singaporeans have given him this mandate. And in the first place, a mandate is a mandate. So even if you won 33 or 35% to 33% and then 30+%, for me a mandate is a mandate. If you won, you won, given the rules. However, 70% is an overwhelming, is the ultimate mandate, and you can't argue against that. And I think he has shown that Singaporeans largely support him. I think that is beyond a shadow of a doubt. This was true in, I know some people also said, oh, but this is lower than his Jurong vote share, which is a bit of a lame criticism, to be honest, because in a presidential election, people are more liberal with their anti-establishment vote, and yet he got 70%. No one was predicting that. So I think how I described it was, this is the ultimate mandate for President-elect Tharman. So I just wanted to say that I think people who say other people have been denied running, so on, I don't think it would have mattered, because the only ultimate metric that mattered for me was the Tharman versus non-Tharman votes. So even if you add all the other, it's 70-30, so it doesn't matter. So that's the first thing. The second thing would be the referendum on the PAP. Now, I have said many times before, my posts, even in my interviews with media outlets, that ultimately the election will be, at least in part, and I argue in large part, a referendum on the PAP. So imagine if today we had done this live and Tharman had gotten 50%. So Mas Agos asked, would you still consider the PA referendum on the PAP? So that's what I wanted to address. So imagine if Tharman got only 50% and he won. For sure, many people, including myself, would be saying that this is a referendum on the PAP and people are upset at the PAP. So we can't have our cake and eat it. We can't say that if the results are not good, it's a referendum on the PAP. If the results are good, it's not a referendum on the PAP, right? So I would say at least in part it is a referendum on the PAP. Now, of course, there's a caveat, right? The caveat is Tharman is more popular than his former party. I think that is undeniable. I think he's the most popular politician in Singapore. Probably PM is second, and he is first, just based on numbers from general election, and I think the presidential election showed that as well. So there is that Tharman factor. However, given that independence was the theme of the election, so much so that Tharman also reacted to these criticisms from his two opponents, from Ng Kok Song and Tan Kin Lian. Independence was the thing that they brought to the table. So they didn't say that they would be a better manager of the reserves and so on than Tharman, but they said they are independent of the ruling party. Given that that was their central theme, and yet Tharman managed to get 70%, you have to say, at least in part, it shows that the PAP brand is not as damaged as a lot of people like to say or think online. And association with the party does not drag a person down completely. If you were to believe what we read online, you would think that that would be such a huge factor. Now, of course, Tharman is unique. He's an anomaly. There is no other Tharman. But I think if I were the PM, I would take comfort from this and think that, oh, if I have really capable candidates, Singaporeans would vote for me, and in spite of whatever has happened, whatever people may say, that the party brand isn't as damaged as a lot of people have claimed. And you can say it's not just it hasn't been as damaged. I would say it's still the most trusted brand in many ways, right? So I think for sure it is a good result for the PAP. I don't think you can say otherwise, right? You cannot say it's a terrible result for the PAP. At best you can say, oh, the Tharman factor far outweighs PAP's popularity or whatever it is, right? But as I said, if the reverse was true, if Tharman did badly, we will all say that this reflects badly on the PAP. So I think it's only fair that since he did well, you have to say at least in part it reflects well on the PAP. Okay? So that's the second thing that I wanted to say, and I think this is quite an important point. I think I already addressed this. As he said, Tharman's reputation precedes or exceeds his former parties, of course, but as I was saying, the independence of the candidates was the central theme of the other two candidates' campaigns, and I think the fact that this didn't become a factor shows that Singaporeans were willing to accept it. And you have to accept that, right, whether you agree or whether you disagree with Singaporeans' judgments. Okay, so the third one is what this means, and it's related to the second point, what this means for the general election. I think that Tharman has set an incredibly high standard for both his party or former party and for future presidential candidates. This is an almost impossible standard to meet, right? 70%. This is difficult, and I think fairly or unfairly his peers will be judged by that. So this has to be balanced with what I said earlier. So even though I think the PAP would and should take comfort in this result, at the same time, if you were to be judged by the 70% standard, then that's also a bit worrying if people are going to judge you by that, right? But I guess that's a problem for another day that they would be thinking about. So there is a question: do you think the PAP will call for a snap poll in view of the landslide? I don't know, but I would be quite buoyed I would be quite excited by the result if I was in the party. There's a comment, I mean, technically all of them have very close ties to the PAP. Yeah, I saw this going around a lot, but I never really bought it. Of course, no doubt, Ng Kok Song, I mean, Tan Kin Lian is clearly not not the PAP candidate. So I don't know how somebody can say that. Of course, he was a former branch secretary and so on, but that reputation is gone already. That's like saying Tan Cheng Bock is part of the PAP. He was, but he no longer is. Ng Kok Song, of course, he's close to the establishment and he's part of the establishment, but he was clearly not the PAP, right? So yes, ties to the PAP, but also he positioned himself as someone who's not opposition, not PAP. So then you have to say that it is at least, going back to my second point, at least in part an endorsement of the PAP, right? So there is a question, what if it is also just because the other candidates were seen as very weak? Perhaps, of course, that is a possibility, but you have had weak candidates still perform better than 16% or 13%. So it is still, people still do vote against the PAP if they do not like the PAP, even with very weak candidates. In Tampines GRC, the National Solidarity Party in 2020 got 30+% of the votes. I guarantee you most of the people who voted for them have never seen these candidates before. And just in terms of saying whether they are weak compared to Ng Kok Song, they are definitely much weaker than Ng Kok Song as a presidential candidate, right? So maybe it was that, or I wouldn't say Ng Kok Song was a weak candidate in that sense. I think he was very capable. He wasn't known. I granted he wasn't known. But at the same time, if the resentment towards the PAP was high, as it was in 2020, I think even weak candidates would do far better. Right? So another question is, do you think Tharman ran a strong campaign? So this is by Theo. I personally felt Ng Kok Song won the campaign, especially with the presidential forum. So I agree with you. On the second part, not the first one. So I think Ng Kok Song did win the presidential forum. I think that particular forum, I mean, Tharman was strong, but I thought he was just a bit stronger. However, the campaign is more than just the forum. Tharman has, of course, the resources, the know-how, the expertise. Just the posters, they were up within a couple of hours, right, of nomination day. I mean, Ng Kok Song didn't have posters, and I must assume that hurt him a little bit. And yeah, so just as I was saying that, Haikal asked that, and I do think him not putting up the posters, it has an effect, right? Even my 8-year-old son says that, how come he doesn't see any poster of Ng Kok Song, right? So I do think it definitely had an effect, and we cannot deny that, right? So and Tharman has been a campaigner before, and I don't think we can underestimate the effect, because you know how to reach out to people, you know where to go, just simple things, right? Perhaps age was a factor too. Ng Kok Song and somebody said Ng Kok Song and Tan Kilian 75 years old. I don't know why or how it would be significant. I think it would be significant if the older candidates seem unhealthy, and Tan Kilian and Ng Kok Song didn't seem unhealthy. I don't think it matters, or it mattered that much. And for those who think that it's significant, may I remind you, Mahathir is 98 years old. He became Prime Minister at 92 years old. I think if you are healthy enough, you are young enough, and I don't think, from my sense at least, that was a significant factor. So yeah, so that's the. Jingran says, I shared with a friend that actually Tharman is being elected in this PE for 12 years at once, so I'm not sure what you mean. But yes, so Tharman's campaign was strong with the collaterals, but also his online campaign was quite superb. The way he reached out to influencers, especially if you think the multiplier effect of those, right? You can have closed door sessions with 30, 40, but if one of them has 10,000, 20,000, 30,000 followers, right? The multiplier effect of that, I think you cannot underestimate. So Tharman's campaign, I think overall was much stronger than the other two, much stronger, and for me it's not even a contest. So would George Goh have eroded Tharman's vote share significantly? I don't think so, because as I said, maybe he would have eroded Ng Kok Song and Tan Kin Lian's, I think significantly Tan Kin Lian's vote share. But it seems like those who voted for Tharman would have voted for Tharman anyway, so I don't think that mattered that much. Okay, so that was the third point. That was third point. Also, you are predicting Tharman would easily win again if he runs again 6 years from now. Well, let's discuss that 6 years from now. So many things can happen. So the fourth point. So okay, there's a question by Kim. This is on my WhatsApp. So, do you think many Singaporeans perhaps are not watching this election closely? Perhaps because of the overriding narrative that the EP has limited powers and is constrained, and hence just voted for the most trusted name they saw on the ballot paper. That is possible, but as I said before in my post, voters always maximize and stretch their votes, right? They do not just vote for the institution of the president or for the person to be president itself, even though there's a lot of that. Other factors such as resentment, general mood, the message they want to send to the government, all of this matter as well, right? So there was another, and just a side point that I think Kim reminded me of. One of the narratives that came out a lot by analysts, by mainstream analysts, mainstream media, there were so many articles, even some politicians were saying, oh, people don't really understand the elected presidency. Even the candidates were saying that. People don't really understand the elected presidency, or people were saying that about the candidates as well. First of all, if people don't understand the nature of the presidency, whose fault is that if it's been around for 3 decades, right? So that's the first thing. And the second thing is, so now that Tharman has won convincingly, are we going to say that, oh, people don't really understand what they were voting for, right? So I think I am really not into voter shaming in this particular way, right? Oh, when you like the results, you say, oh yes, voters understood it. When you do not like the result, voters didn't understand it, right? So it could be that people rely on heuristics, but that's normal for any election, not just the presidency, general election as well, presidency, general election as well, but people always vote to maximize their self-interest, and that's how it should be anyway. So I hope I answered Kim's question. Why wasn't Tharman's vote share higher than his current percentage? I don't know, so this, you want Tharman to get 100% or what, like 70% is huge. So I'll address the non-Chinese Prime Minister in a while. So could it be that Singaporeans vote based on personality? Well, people always vote based on personality and party. That's in every election, and it's not, again, not unique to Singapore, it's every country. So the electoral system will determine what type of considerations voters make. So in a proportional representation system, the party matters more than the personality. In a first past the post or party block vote GRC system, both the candidate and the party matter, right? So I think it's not unique to this election. Every election there is like this. Okay, so I'll address the Prime Minister thing later on. Okay? So the fourth point I wanted to talk about was the spoiled vote. And I think the number of spoiled votes was minuscule. It was about 2%. It's not more than most of the elections. In fact, lower than many of the elections. And I think it shows that people, first of all, spoiling your vote is not that easy. Even if you say you want to do it, once you queue up, it's very difficult to actually follow through. Second of all, it shows that people accepted the legitimacy of this election. Right? 2% spoiled vote, I mean, it's difficult to say that people rejected the election if it's just 2%. It's not a significant number, or not more significant than usual. So therefore, you have to accept that this is legitimate. And you compare the mood today to in 2017, when there was a lot of resentment because there was no election. And I think any fair-minded person would say today that the vibe, to use a language that my audience understands, I think it is quite clear. It is quite clear that the vibe is very different today as compared to 2017. So I think it's impossible to say that the election wasn't legitimate or whatever it is. Whatever issues we all may have had, I've already said I wanted to see George go run. I've already said before that I find the criteria too restrictive. Given the current criteria, 500 million and the public service track, it's very, very limiting, and I don't think that's something I am particularly supportive of. But given the criteria and given the elections, no one, I think, can say that the elections were not legitimate or wasn't reflective of what Singaporeans' aspirations were. Even if you didn't vote for Tharman, you were one of those 29 or 30% of Singaporeans, you have to accept that this result was legitimate. Right? So, but Tharman, Sunshine Storm said that but Tharman has refused to be PM many times. Clearly, he doesn't want to be deeply involved in party politics. He was in the party for over 2 decades, as the SCNA liked to remind us yesterday night when he was at Jurong. He was MP for there for 2 decades. So he was deeply involved in party politics for 2 decades. I'll just push back against that particular statement, sorry. Alright, so subliminal messaging. Okay, so that's it for the spot vote. So let me just briefly talk about okay, there's a couple more questions. One is by Jasminder. Would a 70% victory for Mr. Tharman create a mindset for the PAP that they will win by a bigger margin in the next GA? That's an interesting, a very good question. As I said, I don't think they would be resting on their laurels. You know, there's a saying, right, which I've mentioned before in a couple of episodes, that there are only 2 ways to run an election. Either you are uncontested or you are scared. So if you are contested, you must always be scared, right? And that's why successful parties, they're always paranoid. They're all running with the possibility of losing. And I don't think the PAP will change in that regard. They always run as if there's a possibility of them losing. However, they would be, I think, their confidence will be bolstered by the results, because even though they probably 70% is unrealistic, I think they would be quite pleased with the result and would say that, okay, the party brand is still intact, very, very much like the party brand didn't drag Tharman down. So I think that is the message that they will take. I think they are realistic enough to think that 70% probably will not be possible, but at least close to it, 65 or something like that. You should look in, okay, so I mean, we don't know about these sources, about different areas giving different vote shares to Tharman, yes, and okay, and that could be true, probably is true, but it's not that relevant to this particular discussion. Okay, not sure if low spot votes equals to legitimacy of the PE by we the loving critics. I think it absolutely means that. If that's the case, or if the low spot votes doesn't mean that, the high votes for Tharman doesn't mean that, then what would be a fair criteria to determine whether the election is legitimate? I think it's difficult to say that the election is not legitimate given all of these parameters, unless if there is a criteria that you would suggest. I think it's quite certain, it's quite clear that Singaporeans view the presidential election yesterday, I'm not talking about 2017, I'm talking about yesterday, as absolutely legitimate and something that they would get behind. On race, okay, so, and of course I have discussed this many times before, right? And President-elect Tharman said that Singapore is actually ready for a non-Chinese Prime Minister. And of course I asked the then DPM, the DPM Heng Swee Keat that question a few years ago, and when I was asking the question, I was referring specifically to SM Tharman being the candidate, then SM Tharman being the person who was or who many Singaporeans thought should have been Prime Minister, right? So I definitely thought that Singapore was ready for a non-Chinese Prime Minister, and I am glad that President-elect Tharman agrees with me as well, right? So yes, iconic moment, I suppose, as Kim said. So, however, I would say a few caveats, right? So one is, I would say we didn't need this presidential election to know that Singaporeans were ready for that. the results have always been there. The results have always been there. Like Tharman has always been either the highest performing or one of the highest performing people. Then somebody would say, oh, that's Jurong. And so what? Is Jurong more progressive than the other parts of Singapore? It doesn't make sense, right? So it's just that I didn't need this election to know that Singaporeans would have been ready for that. So that's the first thing I would say. And I think most Singaporeans didn't need this election to see that. So I don't think this election we should really say, oh, this shows that Singapore. I would say that that question has been asked and answered long ago already, right? That Singaporeans were ready, right? Now the second one is now that question actually becomes theoretical, because there is no minority in line that we think Singaporeans would get behind as Prime Minister. Whereas when I was asking that question, at that point in time, it wasn't theoretical. I thought there was a real possibility, because there was someone who was Tharman, that could have been Prime Minister. So the question, I think, becomes less relevant now, right? Because the way I see it, I wouldn't want a minority to be Prime Minister because of that person's race. I just don't want people to be denied a position because of their race. But I don't want to put a person there just because of their race. I don't think that's a healthy way to look at important positions in life as well, especially for a position as consequential as the premiership. You don't want like diversity quotas for those kind of positions. What you want is merit, and the best candidate gets it, regardless of race, religion, and whatever it is, right? So I would say the question is quite theoretical now. Now the third point I would say about this is Tharman is clearly much better than everybody else, right? So to extrapolate and say that this shows race doesn't matter in politics or in life, I would say it's a little bit of a stretch, right? I am not convinced by that argument, because if it took Tharman to be much better, who's much better than everybody else, to obliterate his opposition, well, not everybody is a Tharman, right? So I am not a Tharman, right? Many minorities are not Tharman. There's only one Tharman, right? So I am not sure what we can extrapolate from this, other than the fact that Singaporeans will give the most deserving candidate the victory. So that's what I would say. Now, what is the implication of what I just said? I would say we shouldn't be too quick to say, oh, we need to remove the GRC, for instance, right? Because, as I said, Tharman is an exception, and if you have to be much better than the majority to succeed in a particular field, then I'm not sure whether we can say, oh, that shows that the safeguards that are needed, the safeguards that are in place are not needed anymore, right? So I am in favor of the GRC, because I think, of course, I want it to be smaller. I think in principle I support the GRC, so I disagree with the opposition parties on this. I am not really in favor of the reserve presidency, because I think for that one you let Singaporeans decide, and that's less crucial in terms of multiracial representation anyway. So I think I would be hesitant to say that, oh, this shows that we can do away with racial safeguards. That's what I would say on the particular point of Tharman winning. There is a question. Voting profile by class was not discussed throughout this election. What is your assessment of the relevance of class in this election and future elections? So there have been some studies on this, right? Or at least, and formally, informally, and in 2011, who were the types of people that voted for the PAP and against the PAP? And this, of course, this sorts of profile changes over elections as well. For this particular election, I don't think we have the data for that, but definitely class is one of the more salient cleavages. I would argue more salient than race in many political analysis. 70.4% so far, as I said, means that approximately 2/3 of people voted for him, which means that it's quite likely that some opposition members had voted for him. Yes, I agree. So there's no question there, so I would say I agree. Okay, so that is it that I wanted to say for race, and I think it does. We need to just be careful about making simplistic conclusions from Tharman's victory. Also, Faizah said, so the number of Tharman votes does not necessarily equate to endorsement of the ruling party. I've already addressed that earlier, so maybe can look, maybe, I don't know whether you came in late or something. I'll just repeat. I think at least it shows that the brand isn't as toxic as a lot of people claim it is. So, should reserve presidency be removed? I think so. I am not a huge fan of that, and I think in 2017 it caused far more divisions than necessary. So I would be in favor of that. I think yesterday Eugene Tan said that that safeguard is useful, and I agree with the principle. I just don't think that for the presidency itself you need it. I think it's more crucial for the GRC. Okay, so I'll talk about who I think constituted the Ng Kok Song and Tan Kin Lian votes later on. Right. So the second last point about the opposition, I'll talk about Tan Kin Lian, because I know the CNA spent a lot of time on Tan Kin Lian yesterday. Right. I'll talk about it later on. So the second last point I wanted to talk about is the opposition endorsements, and there are two things to be discussed here, right? So one, the opposition endorsements didn't seem to matter as much because Tan Kin Lian only got 13+% of the votes. And two, what does it predict or portend for these people who endorsed? Did they take a hit when they endorsed Tan Kin Lian, right? So the first thing, I think yes, it didn't matter as much, and also shows that Singaporeans are more discerning than a lot of people think they are, in terms of who they want to vote for. So, and this is just not Singaporeans. A lot of times celebrity endorsements, for instance, in the States also don't matter, because voters, when they decide, and so that's why you have a lot of endorsements, but people don't necessarily go with the endorsements. It could matter, but it wouldn't matter too much, right? So that's the first thing. The second thing is, will it hurt Tan Cheng Bock and Chee Soon Juan? It definitely doesn't help. Definitely doesn't help. I think Workers' Party was smart to stay away from endorsing any of the candidates. So I am cautious to say it would definitely hurt. I said it definitely doesn't help, but I'm not sure whether by 2024, 2025, whether this will be a significant factor for voters, because there will be other things that will matter in the election. So I'm agnostic at this point in time whether it will really matter. So this idea that Zinon was saying, it's not Tan Kin Lian, but the opposition members who endorse Tan Kin Lian, they will probably face an uphill battle. Well, I don't know. I'm agnostic. As I say, it doesn't help. But I'm hesitant to say it will definitely hurt, because there will be many other things that will happen. And also the opposition can say it's not that they were endorsing Tan Kin Lian and his post, but it was just him as the anti-establishment candidate. Right? And it brings me to my final point. The one that I wanted to talk about is about Ng Kok Song and Tan Kin Lian. And okay, so, and we can discuss who exactly voted for people like Ng Kok Song. I think for Ng Kok Song, he had two types of voters. One is the anti-establishment, but thought he would be able to win. And then the other one, or he would get more votes than Tan Kin Lian, so they went with him instead of Tan Kin Lian. Then the second one would be the ones who are more pro-establishment perhaps, but this would be a small number, and then they went for Ng Kok Song because they want to shake things up. So those are the two types of voters, I think. And you know, I've had Ng Kok Song on before. I like him a lot. I think he's extremely capable, and I'm quite heartened to have gotten to know of the existence of such a person in the past 6 weeks, and it gives me hope that there are many such gems within the civil service, within the establishment, you know, that people that we do not know of, but they contribute a lot to the country's running, right? Now, so Tan Kin Lian, right? I just wanted to address this. By the way, sorry, before I get to Tan Kin Lian, there's a question. Electors in Singapore are more rational in their decision making. So I think we need to stop with this Singaporean exceptionalism. And then, of course, comparing to America, voters everywhere are typically rational. Right? Now, their costs and benefits, the way they measure costs and benefits differ from voter to voter, but all of them, nobody wants to vote against their self-interest. They may understand their self-interest differently, right? So we shouldn't pretend like, oh, voters in Singapore are more rational. Then who? Then voters in Malaysia? Then voters in US? I completely disagree with that. I think voters in Singapore are rational, as are voters everywhere, right, generally. So, on Tan Kin Lian, I must say that I think, now, okay, you guys know my positions on race, for sure, and I've discussed this many times. I definitely find his post on Indians, when he said the Mumbai thing, that for me was decidedly racist, right? And whatever he wants to say after that, he didn't mean it, but for me, it was a racist post and there is no justification to it. So I definitely am not a fan, to say the least. However, what I would say is the moral panic that people have displayed about Tan Kin Lian, right? It almost reminds me about how people in the US, right, polite society or mainstream people on the left, people who are more liberal, they don't want to see why somebody like Trump would be popular, right? Or the people in Western Europe don't want to see why right-wing parties would be popular. Of course, that part of the reason is because of racism and xenophobia, in Western Europe, Islamophobia, and so on. But that's not the only reason. It is also basically a middle finger to the establishment in those countries, right? So when people support these candidates, it's not necessarily true that they endorse every single thing that that person has said, but it's the ultimate anti-establishment vote. And that was what I saw with many people I spoke to who said they were going to vote for Tan Kin Lian. I know they are not racist or misogynist, but that was what they said. So I was very taken aback by, including many of my friends, who was saying, oh, it's so important to deny Tan Kin Lian the vote, and so almost not wanting to understand why people would vote there. And again, I don't want to shame voters for choosing who they choose, right? And of course, the other one is it becomes very easy to criticize Tan Kin Lian, right? And you see this on IG stories. I see this all the time, right? It's the easy target. Not that he shouldn't be criticized. I'm just saying that it also became a lot about virtue signaling, and I didn't really want to partake in that because he's such an easy target. As I said, it doesn't mean that he didn't deserve it, but I am quite against virtue signaling a lot of times, and I think I saw that a lot. And I think there was an excessive focus, even yesterday when I was watching the coverage on Tan Kin Lian's post and so on, instead of understanding why people are willing to overlook that, the people who voted for him. In any case, the number was small anyway, so it seems like the moral panic was just that it was hyperbole, it was exaggerated, and it was more panic than reality, right? So somebody said it could be a genuine worry that someone like Tan Kin Lian could be given power. Well, he got 13%. He was never going to win to begin with. He got 13%. The previous election, he got less than 5%. So I think whatever I've said, instead of trying to understand why people would vote for that, then we just go for the easy one, right? Oh, this must be racist. Oh, it must be prevented. And for me, I always try to understand: are there racist people who vote for him? Probably. But I would never say, oh, that constitutes the majority of his voters or anything. Do you think Ng Kok Song also got some of the female voters or younger voters who couldn't accept? Perhaps. I think he did, but we don't have the numbers we don't have the breakdown for that, but perhaps. So that would be everything that I wanted to say, and if you have some questions, I'll be happy to take them for the next 5 minutes. I think I thought I would just speak for 30 minutes, but in any case, I think I have a lot of admiration for anyone who stands in elections, even if I disagree with them. So even Tan Kin Lian, I know people will make fun of him and so on, and in spite of his personal predispositions, I do respect the fact that he put himself out there. Now, I don't respect many of the positions he takes and his political positions, but I do respect the fact that he put himself out there. So I'm thankful that Ng Kok Song, Tan Kin Lian, and George Goh, don't forget him, actually put themselves out there, right? So Theo asked, do you agree with Donald Lowe's analysis that Ng Kok Song represented the old guard capital focus wing of the establishment? No, I disagree with that. I disagree with that assessment, and this idea that, I think Jolene and I have discussed this before in one of our episodes, and about how sometimes in liberal circles people have created an image of Tharman that doesn't really jibe with reality, right? You can refer to those comments later on. Okay. So any predictions for future GEs? No, and nowadays I try to stay away from predictions, because it would just be speculation in the absence of data, right? And the data that you have usually is just based on your close circles. You look at how many predictions were saying, oh, Tharman will get less than 50%, Tharman will get less than 50%, and clearly it went a completely different way. And I think people should understand that our limited interactions are not reflective of the general public sentiment. And ultimately, the best referendum is the vote. Right? The best measure of public sentiment is the vote. Right? So Jess asked, do you think in view of Tharman's landslide victory? So I addressed this earlier. I don't know, but I would be feeling pretty confident if I were from the ruling party. So why can't presidents be young people? I'm honestly sick and tired of these old people being leaders. I don't understand this. I think ageism is one of the last acceptable prejudices. So two things. Firstly, I thought we Asians were the people who valued wisdom and age. And as you get older, you're supposed to be smarter and wiser. So I don't have a problem with people who want to be with us, not worshipping youth and getting older people to be our leaders. I think that's a good thing that should be celebrated. Of course, I'm not saying that we shouldn't have young people in parliament and so on, but generally we accept that the older a person becomes, the wiser the person becomes, right? But of course, as I said, it shouldn't be age, it should be health. And if you are healthy enough, you are young enough. That's what I would say. So given that this election was partially a referendum on the PAP, why haven't the grievances borne out? As I said earlier, I think it shows that maybe the grievances have been exaggerated. Of course, there are grievances, there are genuine grievances, and I think in the GE it will play out slightly differently. I do accept that, but I do think as well that you cannot say that the grievances are beyond repair. So Iggy asks, do you think the lack of publicly available polls resulted in the huge Tharman margin? Perhaps, but again, if people have voted, people have voted, and if they think that Tharman is the choice that they should make in relation to the others, it doesn't matter why they made that determination. The lack of information always matters, and it's not just about polls. It's about you are predicting who is the. For instance, if you were in the 30%, the calculation you would make is who is the one who's more likely to get higher amount of votes, Ng Kok Song or Tan Kin Lian. And in the absence of certainty, or in the absence of information, that would affect how you vote as well. So the lack of information obviously always matters in any election, but ultimately it doesn't matter overall, in the sense that Tharman still got 70%, and that's a resounding victory for him. If Tharman didn't contest and another establishment endorsed candidate stood against both Ng Kok Song and Tan Kee Lian, could we be seeing a different result today? Definitely, it wouldn't be 70%. Now, would I go as far as saying that, oh, then that person would lose? I wouldn't, but definitely it would be lower than 70%. Is it concerning, Samantha asked, that most Singaporeans do not prioritize having an independent president? Well, it depends on how you see the presidency. I think for people who view the president as being a check and balance, then you would find it concerning. But evidently 70% of Singaporeans do not view that as concerning. And if people have voted, they have voted, right, as I said. Do you think, or do you think most votes for Tharman came from the new citizens? So this is, I mean, the undertone of this question, right? First of all, so if new citizens vote, they are citizens as well, so they can vote for whoever they want. Secondly, even if all the new citizens voted for Tharman, it's still not enough to get 70%, right? It's nowhere near. So we cannot just deny reality and say, oh, this most votes for Tharman came from new citizens. Just statistically, that's impossible, right? It's impossible for that. Maybe you meant to ask a different question. Maybe you meant to ask, do most new citizens vote for Tharman, right? And that would be a better question, right? So as I said, so what if they did? It doesn't matter. New citizens, their votes are the same as old citizens, quote unquote, is still one vote. So I wouldn't really like the undertone of that question. I don't really like. But secondly, the numbers are just not there for us to say that, which is often said, right? Oh, PAP wins elections because of new citizens, right? That's not true. You cannot get 60+% just based on new citizens. I've already addressed about too oblivious what a president's role is earlier. And there is one more question, I think. What does it take for an opposition to be PM? You have to win the election, right? So basically it's two things, right? So for you to win the elections, one is for the opposition in Singapore to win the elections, one is the PAP must be perceived to not be good, and second one, the opposition must be perceived to be better. So both incumbent weakness and opposition strength, right? And at this point in time, I don't think we are near that, where it's significant to talk about an opposition person being PM. I think a more realistic one you're thinking about is to deny the 2/3 majority. That would be a more significant target or a realistic, achievable target for the opposition, rather than talk about unseating the PAP. Do you support WP's call to abolish the elected presidency? I'm a bit agnostic on this one, because so on one hand, I do think that there is some value in a figure which is above partisan politics. I do think there is some value in that. On the other, the nature of elections is going to be divisive, right? And especially if we are going to have people who are associated with political parties, then it does, whether it's the opposition or whether it's the ruling party, then it does taint this institution a little. However, we go back to what I said at the start, like 70%, it shows that most Singaporeans are comfortable with this. So how do we argue against that? Which is why I'm pretty agnostic about that. I would be okay either way, I suppose, right? I already addressed Ng Kok Song's campaign. What is next for Jurong GRC? I mean, that's a question for a couple of years, or next GE. But definitely they will not get 75% anymore, because Tharman is not there. what is interesting is to see which opposition party will contest there, right? Whether a stronger, more established opposition party will be contesting there. So this person say, I don't want to mention the name, but this person said that my parents are very anti-establishment but switched to Tharman while queuing up. And I think there will be that. I think there will be people who normally would not vote for the PAP but voted for Tharman nonetheless. Right? Is there a Tan Kin Lian effect? Opposition may be perceived that Tan Kin Lian is bad. I'm not sure I understand the question. Maybe you can clarify. It's interesting to note that many people reminisce about Ong Teng Cheong yet forget that he was also a DPM before becoming president. I am not sure what your point is, Zenon. Are you saying that therefore there's a possibility that Tharman would go against the government, or because it has happened before? Maybe you can clarify that point. Or is there a Tan Kin Lian effect where opposition may not want to vote for Tan Kin Lian because of what he said? Yes, but there's the option of Ng Kok Song. There's also the option of spoiled votes, right? So if you don't want to do that, there are two other options before you get to Tharman, right? So if you get to Tharman, it's still reflective of something before that. So I think that's it. And if there are no more questions, I think I will take my leave and thank you. So do you think the requirements to run for the presidency are too stringent? I already said yes, I do think it is the case. And I would be in favor of reforming the criteria at least, right? And I've addressed the other questions. I think I asked first question, but I'll just repeat this. Do you think the establishment would see this as a vote of confidence for them? I think they would. I think they should to some extent. I know I would see it as an endorsement of some sort. With I would say it's a qualified endorsement for sure, but it definitely is an endorsement to some extent. So Pixelated Zoe asked, do you think Tharman had the help of creatives such as Royston Tan? Royston Tan was on his team, so he had the help. Maybe you're asking whether the endorsement method, and I think for sure more so than Royston, I think his campaign to influencers I think was pretty good. So Zenon said many non-Tharman supporters kept promoting Ong Teng Cheong independence for some reason, because the independence was proven after that already. So I'm not quite sure what the criticism of that is, because if it's been proven, then you definitely can talk about the independence, right? And I think that's what people are reminiscing about. I'm not sure whether that is a fair critique of people praising Ong Teng Cheong, right? But maybe you can clarify that again. Okay, if there's nothing else, if I keep taking comments, I will not go. So thank you so much for joining, and I'll be uploading this later. And we do have President Tharman, and as I said, the way I see elections is that's the arena for citizens to settle our differences. And once it's settled, we move on. We move on to the next election. We move on with governing. And it's very important for us to take elections as that ultimate arena for us to settle the differences, which is why it's very important for us to keep our elections legitimate. And voting is secret. Yesterday I got a couple of questions. Voting is absolutely secret. So, and I think whatever our criticisms of the electoral system is, and I have articulated them as well, including the criteria, the restrictive criteria, you cannot say that the elections are fraudulent and not legitimate. I definitely don't say that, and therefore the results are reflective of the people's aspirations, even if you did not vote, even if your candidate did not win. Alright, enjoy your weekend everyone. Bye bye.